If you ask me what most people get wrong about compounding, I would not begin with returns. I would begin with disappointment, because disappointment is where almost everybody loses. They do not lose because the market refused to reward patience forever. They lose because the early stage feels so insultingly small that they decide the whole idea must be broken. They put money away month after month, check the balance, and see a number that looks almost disrespectful compared with the effort required to build it. They say no to things, they stay consistent, they delay gratification, they do the mature, boring, responsible work. Then they open the account and the growth looks tiny enough to be mocked. That is the emotional ambush. I have watched it happen more times than I can count. A young saver does everything right for 4 or 5 years and then begins asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, why is this not changing my life yet? The right question is, have I stayed in the game long enough for the machine to wake up? Those are very different questions. The first one is impatient and personal. The second one is structural and useful. I want to tell you about a young woman I met years ago. I will call her Elena. Elena was 29, responsible, and more disciplined than she gave herself credit for. She had been putting money into her retirement account and a taxable investment account every single month. Nothing dramatic, 200 here, 300 there. Sometimes a bonus contribution, sometimes just the base amount. No glamorous trades, no brilliant stock picking. No casino behavior, just ordinary consistency. After several years, she looked at the balance and felt almost offended by it. She had roughly the amount you would expect a serious but not high-earning young saver to have. Enough to prove discipline, not enough to feel transformed. And what entered her mind was the same poison that enters the minds of millions of people at exactly the wrong time. Is this even worth it? That sentence has delayed more freedom than almost any bear market, because the early stage of compounding is emotionally ugly. It asks for adult behavior while offering child-sized rewards. That is why weak people leave early. Not because the math failed, because the math is still warming up while the emotions are already screaming for proof. I have never liked financial advice that tells people to be patient without telling them what patience is likely to feel like. That is too vague. It sounds noble and helps no one. If I tell a man to be patient but give him no framework for how the first stage behaves, then all I have really done is hand him a moral slogan and wish him luck. I prefer frameworks. I prefer telling the truth about what the early years demand, what structure matters, what emotional traps arrive on schedule, and what tiny adjustments can make the final result radically larger than people imagine. That is why I want to walk you through a simple idea that I think captures the whole problem elegantly. I call it the 7-5-3-1 discipline, not because numbers are magic, because a memorable structure helps people stay sane long enough for the economics to work. 7 years, 5 categories, 3 emotional attacks, 1 annual increase. That is the architecture. And if you understand those 4 pieces deeply, you will stop treating your portfolio like a machine that is supposed to entertain you in year 3 and start treating it like the slow engine of independence it actually is. Let me begin with the first number, 7 years. When I say 7 years, I do not mean 7 years because I enjoy arbitrary suffering. I mean 7 years because most people underestimate how much time broad market compounding needs before it begins feeling like something more than disciplined irritation. A year is noise, 2 years is often still mood, 3 years can easily be a false teacher. A short run of good markets makes reckless people think they are gifted. A short run of bad markets makes disciplined people think they are cursed. Neither conclusion deserves respect. Markets do not reveal their deeper lesson to people standing too close to the fluctuations. That is why I have always preferred long windows when judging business performance and investing behavior. You want enough time for the foolishness of the crowd to be averaged out, enough time for bad periods and recoveries to both occur, enough time for the saver to stop asking whether this month was exciting and start asking whether the process is becoming trustworthy. 7 years is not a magic guarantee. It is a psychological and mathematical threshold that forces you out of the childish habit of using 1 or 2 calendar years as the judge of a long-term machine. If you have studied the history of broad American equities over many decades, you quickly see a pattern. The shorter the holding period, the more the outcome behaves like a coin toss with personality. extend the horizon, and the odds of a sensible outcome improve dramatically. That is not because risk disappears. It is because time starts doing what time does best. It gives strong productive systems room to recover from recessions, absorb crashes, digest fear, and continue the longer arc of growth. A person who measures compounding in 1 year is treating a forest like a potted plant. A person who measures it over 7 years is finally starting to respect what kind of organism it is. But the reason 7 years matters is not only about return data. It matters because the first 7 years reorganize your mind if you let them. In the first year, you still think like a consumer. You look at your contribution and compare it to things you could have bought. Instead, in year 2, you still think like a critic. You judge the whole process by how unimpressive the visible result feels. In year 3 and 4, frustration arrives. You start hearing the whispers. Maybe I should trade more aggressively. Maybe I should chase something hotter. Maybe I am too conservative. Maybe compounding is just a fairy tale rich people tell disciplined workers, so those workers stay calm and keep feeding the system. That voice arrives right on time. It always has. If you survive it, something interesting begins to happen. Your relationship with the account changes. You stop checking it for entertainment. You stop expecting applause from it. You stop asking it to solve your identity crisis. It becomes a planted field, not a lottery ticket. That shift alone is worth years of effort. Because once a person stops demanding immediate emotional validation from long-term investing, he becomes much harder to manipulate. The market cannot jerk him around so easily. Financial media cannot seduce him so easily. Friends bragging about their latest hot trade cannot unsettle him so easily. He has finally learned what kind of game he is in. That matters more than many people think. A lot of wealth is not built by superior intelligence. It is built by correct emotional classification. The person understands whether the current event is noise, pain, opportunity, or real structural damage. Most people classify poorly because they have not stayed in the system long enough to see its rhythms. 7 years begins to educate the temperament. Now, 7 years alone is not enough if the structure is foolish. That brings me to the second number, 5 categories. When I say 5 categories, I do not mean 5 random tickers chosen because somebody on the internet sounded confident. I do not mean 5 funds that all own essentially the same giant American growth companies while pretending to be diversified. I mean 5 genuinely different kinds of exposure that help you remain invested because they do not all behave identically at the same moments. The great purpose of diversification is not decoration. It is survival. A man who survives long enough gets to enjoy compounding. A man who gets emotionally or financially blown out does not. That is why I want the structure to be plain and sturdy. The first category is the foundation, broad market ownership. If I were building from scratch for most ordinary people, I would want the largest share of capital sitting in broad index exposure that owns the productive engine of major businesses rather than gambling on my ability to guess which one will be the hero this year. This can be the S&P 500. It can be a total U.S. market fund. It can be a simple, broad, low-cost vehicle that gives you ownership in many businesses at once. What I care about here is not cleverness. It is participation in a wide, productive base. This is where your long-term core lives. Why does this matter? Because the broad market is still one of the best reflections we have of human productivity scaled through business ownership. Over long periods, people invent, sell, improve, adapt, cut costs, build brands, create services, and push the economy forward. You do not need to predict which toothpaste company or software company or logistics company will dominate 10 years from now in order to benefit from that general engine. You only need to own it sensibly and leave it alone long enough. For most people, this first category should be the largest chunk, not because it is perfect, because it is robust. The second category is dividend strength. I like assets that pay you even when markets stop flattering you. There is a psychological power in watching cash continue to arrive from businesses built to distribute a portion of their earnings. Dividend payers are not magic. They do not make you immune to bad markets. But they remind the investor that owning a business is not only about hoping somebody later pays more for the shares, it is also about cash flows generated by the enterprise. When you own strong dividend businesses or dividend-focused funds, you own companies that are often more mature, more cash generative, and in many cases more disciplined. Think of businesses people continue using in boring, ordinary life. Consumer staples, utilities, some healthcare names, certain industrials, strong franchises that are not trying to prove their importance every quarter with theatrical promises. These are not always the most exciting assets in a roaring speculative phase. That is usually one reason I like them. They help stabilize the temperament. A person who sees dividend cash continuing during dull or painful stretches is less likely to start believing nothing is happening. Reinvested dividends matter more than the public gives them credit for, over long periods. That quiet drip of ownership buying more ownership becomes a meaningful part of the machine. The third category is smaller growth. This is the category many people either ignore entirely or handle idiotically. Smaller companies, small and mid-cap growth exposure, businesses with more runway and more volatility, can play an important role because they add a different growth engine than giant established firms. Over very long periods, smaller companies have often rewarded investors willing to tolerate messier behavior in exchange for more room to expand. But because they are messier, they must be handled as part of a system, not as a personal adventure. I do not want a household portfolio built on fever dreams. I want smaller growth as a contained source of upside, enough to matter, not enough to emotionally hijack the whole structure. This category teaches something important. Compounding is not about owning only the safest, dullest things. It is about arranging risk so that the portfolio can both survive and grow. Too much caution can starve the upside. Too much appetite can destroy the base. The art lies in keeping both in conversation. The fourth category is international exposure. Many Americans invest as if the United States is the whole map. It is not. The U.S. is a magnificent business environment in many respects, and I have spent my life benefiting from that fact. But a person who owns only domestic exposure is still making a concentration decision, whether he admits it or not. International exposure matters for two reasons. First, it broadens the sources of growth. Second, it reminds you that no country, however strong, should be treated as though it is permanently entitled to carry your entire portfolio alone. There will be periods when other parts of the world outperform. There will be currency effects, policy differences, valuation differences, sector differences, demographic differences, and cycles that make international exposure valuable, not because it always wins, but because it does not move in perfect lockstep with your home market. The point is not to worship foreign markets. The point is to stop acting like your domestic comfort zone is automatically complete. That is not diversification. That is patriotism dressed as portfolio construction. The fifth category is defense, cash equivalents, short-duration bonds, treasuries, maybe some conservative ballast depending on age, goals, and the stage of life. Young investors often mock this category because it does not generate the kind of returns that make people brag. That misses the point completely. Defensive assets are there to help you stay alive mentally and financially when the market reminds you that it is not your employee. The purpose of defense is not excitement. It is optionality, it is stability, it is the ability to buy more when other people are too frightened or too fully allocated to act. If you are 25, that category may be small. If you are 55, that category may deserve more respect. If you are near a major purchase or a life transition, it matters even more. The size of the bucket can change the logic of having the bucket should remain. Now notice what this 5-category structure does. It gives the mind evidence that the whole portfolio is not one mood that matters. When growth stalls, dividends still speak. When smaller companies suffer, the broad base may hold better. When domestic markets wobble, international exposure may behave differently. When everything gets ugly, defense gives you dry powder and reduces panic. It is not perfection, it is resilience. and resilience is the thing that lets compounding survive long enough to become visible. I have often said that if you cannot stay in the game, the returns you imagine do not matter. The first job of a portfolio is not to impress, it is to endure. But even with the right categories and the right timeline, human beings still bring the greatest source of destruction into the room: emotion. That is the third number. 3 emotional attacks. I do not call them phases because phase sounds too tidy, as if they arrive once and then politely leave. These feelings revisit people many times, but they do tend to arrive in a certain order when someone is trying to build wealth properly. The first emotional attack is doubt. Doubt usually arrives in the early years. You are doing the mature thing and it feels like it is being punished. You invest regularly. You pass on unnecessary spending. You make sacrifices others do not see. Then you check the account and the gain looks almost rude. This is when the voice begins. Maybe I am doing it wrong. Maybe the returns are too low. Maybe I need something faster. Maybe other people know something I do not. Maybe patience is just what unsuccessful people call not knowing what else to do. Doubt is dangerous because it often sounds intelligent. It dresses itself like sophistication. It says the disciplined path is naive and the shiny path is informed. Then it lures people into abandoning a solid plan before the plan has had enough time to justify itself. I have seen people reset their timeline 3 or 4 times without realizing that what they keep calling a smarter strategy is really just repeated impatience. The antidote to doubt is not blind optimism. It is memory and structure. Know why you own what you own. Know your time horizon. Know that the first stage is supposed to feel underwhelming. If the first stage felt exhilarating, more people would endure it. The very discomfort of early compounding is one reason the payoff later belongs to relatively few. The second emotional attack is frustration. Doubt asks whether the system is wrong. Frustration asks why the system is so slow. This is subtler and more dangerous because it often arrives after years of correct behavior. The saver says, I have already proved discipline, I have already been patient, I have already contributed for several years. Surely by now I should feel something more dramatic. That is where people start rating the portfolio for other uses. The money becomes a future car, a future vacation, a small rescue fund for something that feels emotionally urgent or worse. It becomes the seed for a foolish idea that offers excitement in exchange for structure. Frustration usually peaks right before the curve begins getting interesting. That is the cruel joke of compounding. The hardest years psychologically are often the final years before momentum becomes visible enough to feel rewarding. It is like pushing a heavy machine. Early effort produces almost no spectacle, but the effort is not wasted. It is storing momentum. Then eventually the machine begins carrying itself. A man who quits in the slow stretch always thinks he quit because the process was not working. Most of the time he quit because he left just before the process would have finally started looking like what he imagined from the beginning. The third emotional attack is panic, and panic is the one that can undo a decade. Panic does not arrive because you were not warned. It arrives because markets know how to make adults feel small. A serious drawdown has a way of turning all the lofty principles into something physical. The account falls. The headlines darken. Other people start saying, we have never seen this before. Your neat plan suddenly feels like a childish piece of paper facing a storm. That is when people do the costliest thing. They confuse temporary pain with permanent truth. They sell because the discomfort of uncertainty feels unbearable. Then, when the market recovers, which it has a vulgar habit of doing after scaring the majority badly enough, they are forced to watch their own future leave without them. This is why I always say panic is rarely protective. It feels protective. That is what makes it lethal. The person believes he is avoiding loss when in fact he is locking it in and donating the recovery to somebody more stable. The antidote to panic is not courage alone. It is pre-commitment. Decide before the crash what you will do during the crash. Will you continue contributions? Will you rebalance? Will you avoid checking the balance every day? Will you read market history instead of headlines? Will you remember that a lower price on a good asset is not automatically a tragedy? If your horizon is still long, will you keep buying? I want those decisions made in calm weather because people are terrible at writing wise rules while their stomach is tight. This is why structure beats emotion again and again. Now let me turn to the final number, one annual increase. This may be the most underrated part of the whole framework because it sounds too small to change a life. But small annual increases are how moderate savers become formidable savers over time without feeling as though they stepped into a punishment chamber. A flat contribution is better than no contribution, but a growing contribution is where compounding really begins learning your name. If a person invests $300 a month for decades, he will still build something meaningful if he stays consistent. But if he increases that contribution even modestly each year, 5%, maybe less at first, the difference over 30 years becomes astonishing. Why? Because life itself is not flat. Income tends to rise. Debt gets paid off, children leave home, skills improve, raises happen. Bonuses happen, expenses change. If the contribution never changes while life evolves, then the compounding machine is being starved unnecessarily. People think they need dramatic jumps to matter. They do not. A small annual increase does two beautiful things. First, it grows the capital flow without causing much psychological pain. Second, it ties your investment life to your adult progress. As you become more capable, more productive, and more compensated, the machine gets fed more. That is what creates acceleration. A person who contributes the same amount for 30 years is still running. A person who slightly increases contributions every year eventually looks like he found some secret. He did not. He just refused to leave the machine at one speed while the rest of his life evolved. I want to give you a more human picture of how this works. Let us imagine Elena again. Say she began with $200 a month in her late 20s. For years it felt underwhelming. She looked at the account and saw a respectable but not life-changing balance. Now imagine she does four things. She commits mentally to at least 7 years before allowing herself to judge the process. She arranges her portfolio around the 5 categories rather than around women noise. She learns the 3 emotional attacks and refuses to confuse them with insight. And each year, quietly, she nudges the monthly contribution a little higher, not enough to hurt, enough to matter. By year 7, she does not feel rich. That is fine. The goal was never to feel rich in year 7. The goal was to stop behaving like an impatient amateur. By year 10, the account starts looking less decorative. By year 15, the portfolio begins contributing in a way that no longer feels trivial. By year 20, the machine is no longer something she carries by herself. It is finally helping carry her. That is the whole point. The crossover is what people misjudge. At first, labor does all the lifting. Later, capital begins doing a larger share. The early saver says, I am doing all the work and getting very little help. The later saver says, I cannot believe the money itself is now adding this much. That second sentence is purchased by surviving the years required to make the first sentence no longer true. I have seen the same contrast in older men too. One man starts at 35, contributes faithfully, increases the amount as life improves, and handles market pain like weather instead of prophecy. Another man starts at the same age with the same dollar amount, but keeps interrupting himself. He panics in a crash, stops for a year, restarts late, flattens contributions forever because adjusting upward feels inconvenient. Chases one idea, withdraws for a car, rebuilds, stops again. At 65, the difference between them looks like a difference in talent. It is usually a difference in continuity. Continuity is one of the most mispriced advantages in financial life. The public loves brilliance because brilliance photographs well. Continuity often wins. I want to dwell on this because the whole culture of investing is designed to make continuity feel unsophisticated. Constant market commentary, constant predictions, constant emphasis on what is hot now. All of it tempts the saver to believe that movement equals intelligence. It usually does not. In many cases, movement is simply the emotional inability to remain aligned with a sensible long plan. A good process should feel almost boring from the outside. That is one reason it works. If it were constantly thrilling, it would probably be too fragile. Let me make this even more practical. If I were sitting across from a young worker or a middle-aged saver right now and asking what to do with this framework, I would give them something like the following mental order. First, decide whether you are willing to commit to the 7-year horizon emotionally, not just mathematically. This means you do not get to declare the process broken in year 3 because it felt slow. You already knew it would feel slow. That was part of the contract. Second, examine the portfolio honestly. Does it really contain 5 categories or just several names that all effectively behave the same way? If everything rises and falls for the same reason, then you may have variety without diversification. Third, write the 3 emotional attacks down in your own language. What does doubt sound like in your mind? What does frustration sound like? What does panic sound like? The better you know their voices, the less likely you are to mistake them for wisdom when they return. Fourth, schedule the annual contribution increase. Now, do not hope you will remember it when life gets busy. Tie it to a month, a salary review, a birthday, a calendar event, something that removes negotiation. Fifth, stop checking the account in ways that manufacture suffering. I have no issue with awareness. I do have an issue with turning ordinary market motion into a daily referendum on your self-worth and strategy. There is another point that deserves attention. This framework is not only about wealth, it is about identity. A person who survives the first 7 years correctly becomes somebody else, not flashy, not transformed into a market celebrity, transformed into someone with a better nervous system around money. He becomes less temptable, less theatrical, less likely to chase, less likely to confuse boredom with insight, more able to let time do its work. That identity upgrade may be even more important than the account balance in the early stages, because once the behavior is correct, scale eventually follows. A wrong behavior with more money just becomes a larger mess. A correct behavior with more money becomes a much larger victory. That is also why I want to separate compounding from luck. Luck matters in the short run. Compounding is what makes luck less important over the long run. If you stay invested through many seasons, if you diversify sensibly, if you survive your own mind, if you keep feeding the machine more each year, then one bad year matters less. One bad decade can still hurt. Yes, but even then, structure matters. The saver who continues during ugly periods is buying future recovery at lower prices, whether he emotionally enjoys it or not. I often tell people that the market is one of the only places where everyone loves bargains in theory and hates them in practice. When stocks are expensive, people feel confident. When they are cheap, people feel endangered. That inversion destroys compounding for millions. The disciplined saver learns to reverse it, not emotionally perhaps, but behaviorally. He contributes anyway. That anyway is where fortunes come from. Another hidden benefit of the 7-5-3-1 discipline is that it removes the illusion that one perfect asset will save you. I do not like savior thinking in portfolios. The broad market is not a savior. Dividends are not a savior. Smaller growth is not a savior. International exposure is not a savior. Defense is not a savior. The annual increase is not a savior. Time is not a savior by itself. What matters is the system together. That is how most strong results are built in real life. Not by one perfect part, but by several good parts aligned correctly over a long enough period that the weaknesses of one are carried by the strengths of another. This is how good businesses are built too. No single product saves them. No single employee saves them. No single quarter saves them. Strong systems save them. A household portfolio deserves the same respect. Now I want to say something that younger savers especially need to hear. Do not be ashamed of a small beginning. A small beginning handled correctly is worth far more than a larger beginning handled emotionally. People become embarrassed by modest contributions. They compare themselves with people earning more. They mock their own first 10,000, first 20,000, first 50,000, because the internet has made ordinary progress feel invisible. That is a profound mistake. Small beginnings are where the real character of compounding gets tested. A person who can continue with modest size can usually continue with larger size. A person who quits because the early balances felt unimpressive would have found a reason to quit later too. The problem was not the amount. The problem was the behavior. treat the early stage with respect. It is where the roots are laid. You do not laugh at roots because the fruit is not visible yet. At least you do not if you understand how growth works. The same goes for annual increases. Do not wait until you can suddenly double contributions heroically. That kind of thinking delays people for years. Small increases count: $10, $20, $50, a percentage rise tied to income, a redirection of money from a debt that just ended, a raise partially captured instead of fully consumed. That is how serious people do it. Not with cinematic declarations, with recurring acts of quiet capture. The future gets fed before lifestyle learns about the new money. That is wisdom. I also want to speak for a moment to the person already behind schedule, or at least feeling behind schedule. Perhaps you are 42 and only now getting serious. Perhaps you are 50 and regret years of weak behavior. Perhaps you have no clean 7-year runway emotionally because the calendar makes you feel exposed. Fine, the framework still matters. Maybe your defense allocation is higher. Maybe your annual increases matter even more. Maybe the emotional attacks sound different because regret joins the room. But the structure is still useful. 7 years may not make you feel young again. That was never the goal. It can still transform the slope of the remaining journey if you stop asking what should have happened and start asking what correct behavior now looks like. That is all adulthood ever really asks: correct behavior. Now, not perfection in the past. If you want to know why some investors build moderate wealth and others build life-changing wealth from similar beginnings, the answer is often buried in that final number one annual increase. Because flat contributions create respectable outcomes. Rising contributions create outcomes that feel almost unfair in retrospect. The public does not appreciate this because the change is too small each year to trigger excitement. But finance does not care whether the improvement felt exciting. It only cares whether it happened. That is why a 5% increase can matter so much. It mirrors life without strangling life. You barely feel it in the month. You deeply feel it in the decade. That is a magnificent trait in a financial habit. And of course, none of this will make for entertaining cocktail party conversation. No one wants to hear that. Getting rich may involve 7 years of underwhelming feelings, boring diversification, surviving your own doubt, and increasing contributions by amounts too small to brag about. The public prefers fairy tales. I prefer machinery. Machinery is what builds wealth. So if I were trying to leave you with the simplest possible truth about compounding, it would be this. The reason compounding feels disappointing at the beginning is not because it is weak. It is because it is still gathering force. The reason most people never see the exciting part is not because the exciting part does not exist. It is because they keep stepping off the escalator just before the ride starts carrying them. The 7531 discipline exists to keep you on the escalator 7 years, so you stop misjudging short-run noise. 5 categories, so you stop confusing concentration with conviction. 3 emotional attacks, so you can recognize the enemy when it speaks in your own voice. 1 annual increase, so the machine gets stronger as you get older instead of staying trapped at the size of your former life. That is how I would want an ordinary disciplined person to think. Not in terms of getting rich next year, in terms of becoming structurally difficult to stop. If you become difficult to stop, wealth has a way of finding you over time, not all at once, not theatrically, but with a kind of inevitability that looks obvious only in hindsight, and that, in my experience, is how the most durable financial victories happen. Quietly at first, then all at once enough that people who were never there for the early struggle begin calling it luck.